welcome back to another episode of ADK Talks. I'm Jane, here with my co-host and brother Steve. Say hi, Steve.
Hi, Steve.
Today's episode brings together three topics that we know our listeners love. First, the Adirondacks. Second, true crime. And third, the paranormal. More than a century ago, a tragic story unfolded at Big Moose Lake in the central Adirondacks. It was a story of ambition, secrecy, betrayal, and murder. This is the case of Chester Gillette and Grace Brown. It became one of the most sensational trials of the early 20th century, inspiring a landmark American novel and one of Hollywood's most iconic films. But the story doesn't really end with a trial. Today, we're welcoming back our friends from the Adirondack Park Paranormal Society, or APS for short, who have investigated the old jailhouse where Gillette was tried and later executed. Today, we're going to explore the true crime story itself, who Chester Gillette was, and Grace Brown, what happened at Big Moose Lake, and why the case became such a cultural phenomenon. Then, next week, in part 2, APS is going to tell us all about their investigations inside the historic Herkimer jailhouse, where some believe echoes of that story may still linger. So before we begin, let's welcome back the team from APS, and I'm going to have them introduce themselves and their roles. Damon, I'm going to start with you.
So I'm Damon Jacobs. I started the team, too many years ago now. 2008 was when I originally started the team. It was Saranac Lake Paranormal Society back then, and then I renamed it just because we were too close to another team's name in 2011. And we've been kind of just kicking along ever since.
Yeah, we were thrilled to have you on, I think it was last year, maybe about this time. Yeah. And it's been one of our most popular episodes, but it's been great. Sandy, let's go over to you. Tell us about what you do with APS and your role.
Sure. Well, my name is Sandy Silverstein. My husband Dave and I live in the Utica, New York area, so we're a few hours south of the majority of the team, but we all hooked up together through another group that Dave and I used to belong to, and when we left that group, we decided to join APS because we have such a respect for the team that we really wanted to work with them. And so we've been with APS since, I think it was 2022, if I'm not mistaken. Right, Damon?
It was shortly after we did the Russia Union Church. So
yes.
2021 into 2022. Yep.
Right. So we've been for several years now with them. It's very difficult for me to just give myself a label because I'm still in the process of learning about the things that I can do. But I'd say that I have some mediumistic abilities, some psychic abilities. I'm a very strong empath. And so I sort of lend that skill set to the team during investigations, as well as the traditional role of a paranormal investigator. I like to use the scientific equipment and pair that along with the feelings, the names, all of that kind of thing that I do get during and before the investigation. So that's my role. I kind of go between the two. I try to find a really good balance when investigating with the team. And what it does, I think, is along with the other members of the team who do have some sensitivities, I think it works really well with the research that's done beforehand, because I don't like to go into any investigation with much information at all. So I think the two marry well together and really work well for the investigation. So I kind of take a bit of a role of just doing a little bit of everything for the team.
Awesome. Christina, tell us about you.
Hi, I'm Christina Bloom. I'm a professional psychic and have been for 26 years. I actually joined the team 22, 23, somewhere in there.
We all lose track of it after a while.
About the same time, Christine. It was around the 2022 area.
Yeah, I thought it was around 2022. But I actually live in Wisconsin. I'm in southeast Wisconsin near the Milwaukee area, and we vacation a lot in the Adirondacks. So I was there. We've decided we want to move there. We're still working on that. But I was looking for my people, like I was there looking for my people. And I was at the Hotel Saranac and saw the name on the wall, which I know is not the correct name, but that's okay. It's close enough. It got me here. So they gave me the Facebook group for apps, and I sent a message. And that evening I was in a 3-hour, let's call it an interview. It was a big chat session.
Interrogation.
Yeah, it was an interview both ways. And before I left to come back the next day, I was a member of APPS.
That's awesome. Jen, tell us about you and your background.
I'm kind of the same feeling as Sandy. I do have some psychic abilities and medium abilities that I'm still exploring. My first investigation was
COVID.
Hotel Saranac. Their second investigation of Hotel Saranac, and I was hooked. That's all it took was that one, and I've been part of the team ever since.
Well, I have to be honest, I didn't really know the Chester Gillette story until you guys were on last year. But since then, I've read a lot about it. I didn't realize at first that the movie, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, A Place in the Sun, which starred Elizabeth Taylor, Montgomery Clift, was based on a novel based on the story of Chester and Grace Brown. But it's really an incredible story. So let's just talk a little bit about this. Chester was born in Montana to a middle-class family, correct?
Correct.
But his parents renounced their wealth. They were very comfortable, but they renounced their wealth and joined the Salvation Army, which in those days meant that they were traveling around preaching and conducting Bible studies. Chester was eventually sent to prep school, paid for by a wealthy uncle at Oberlin College, where he got his education. And then he came to work for another uncle in Cortland, New York, at his skirt factory. And this was all in the early 1900s, correct?
That is correct.
What can you tell us, though, about Grace Brown? Because I haven't read much about her, and they encountered each other at that skirt factory.
Yeah, Grace came from a small town just outside of Cortland, DeRuyter, and her family lived on a farm. And because my husband, Dave, and I are such history lovers, as is the rest of the team, we have a seasonal camp, and it's just outside of Morrisville, New York, which is only about an hour north of Cortland. So we go down that way. We try to find the most historic places. And the Grace Brown Chester Gillette story has always fascinated me. And so we actually went to the site, or as close as we could, to the site of her farm growing up. They were not wealthy. She came from the other side of the tracks, so to speak. She had brothers and sisters. She eventually helped out at the local school. She was well known in the community, but again, they were just farmers. And so she decided that she would like to go to Cortland and do work. So she ended up at the Gillette skirt factory, and that's where she met Chester. She lived in a boarding house that was just about, I think it's about 5 blocks from where the skirt factory was. So she would walk back and forth every day, and Chester was there working for his uncle. I believe, don't quote me, but I believe he had gotten into a little bit of trouble, and that's how he ended up staying with his uncle, and his uncle gave him the job. And they struck up sort of a flirtationship. Chester was the type of young man who enjoyed the attention of the ladies, so to speak. And Grace had a little crush on him, and so they struck up a flirtationship, and the next thing you know, he's visiting her at her boarding house. And back in those days, it really was courting, so to speak. But obviously, eventually, the courting moved on to more than just courting. And before she knew it, Grace was pregnant. Grace was in love with Chester. Here was the young man whose uncle owned the skirt factory. Obviously comes from a wealthy family, even if he wasn't raised as a wealthy person himself. in his younger years, had an air of money, and she was just enamored by him. And he took full advantage of Grace and her ways and her, small town farm girl ways. And the next thing she knew, she was pregnant. And Chester at the same time had been actually courting another girl. And this girl came from money. And this girl had a wealthy family and had a future ahead of her and certainly did not work in a skirt factory. And so Grace, at the time, thought that Chester wanted to be with her until he didn't. She ended up going back home after she found out she was pregnant and living there for some time, and wrote several different letters to Chester in Cortland, at first very excited about their future together, and then he would not answer her for quite a while, and then it became more, not demanding, but a little more frantic. Her letters became more frantic, almost begging.
I can't even imagine being pregnant and unmarried at that time in U.S. history. I mean, it's hard now.
Exactly.
But
exactly.
the unbelievable, social consequences that would have had for a young woman without many means, it must have been terrifying.
I'm sure it was. And she was so desperate by the end of the letter writing that she started to threaten, essentially, that she would tell everyone that Chester was the father, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's when Chester did eventually respond to her, and they came up with this plan to run away together. And I say that in air quotes because Grace believed that they were marrying each other and going to live, going off to live this wonderful life. But that's not quite how it turned out.
No. So he suggests that they take this trip to the Adirondacks together.
Yeah.
And he had every intention at that point of putting an end to whatever relationship by any means at the outset. This wasn't something that, he happened on the trip. He was fully planned to do something to end the problem.
Yeah, there's been debate over the years as to when he actually finalized his plans, so to speak. Some say he knew as soon as he made the arrangements with her to meet him. Again, I can't remember if she actually met him in Cortland or if they met in Utica, New York, which is about halfway from Cortland to Big Moose Lake. But they did eventually meet up, and she packed her suitcase. She was all excited. She was ready to go start her new life with her seemingly new husband and baby on the way. And then the rest is history. But there is some debate as to when he actually, I know that in his court trial, the defense tried to say that he had never planned anything. But we all know that at some point, whether it was in Cortland before he left or on the way up there, he sort of finalized his plan. Now, one thing that's interesting about that is that they found out that he had actually purchased a tennis racket beforehand, which led them to believe that it was quite early in the trip when he knew for sure what was going to happen, because that tennis racket came into play quite a bit during his trial.
And I want to quickly pause here for our listeners, many of whom are either in New York City or New Jersey or may not be familiar with all of New York State. Cortland that area is almost like the geographic center of New York. It's sort of south of, we talked about Utica and Syracuse. It's rural. Both of our parents sort of grew up in that area. I went to college in that area. And it's also in those days, there aren't super highways, but they would probably have to take a train to get to Utica, which actually has a beautiful train station if you're ever in Utica. And then so I just wanted to geographically locate for folks who might not be that familiar. And then Utica it's not in the Adirondacks, but it's just sort of the western, almost some people call that area like the gateway.
It's very close.
Yeah,
it's very close. Yeah.
Sort of the foothills of the
Yeah.
Adirondacks, so to speak.
Yeah, but the western side of the Adirondacks, where people think of like Glens Falls and Saratoga, is the southern sort of foothills. This is sort of the southwestern part of the Adirondacks that they're going into, which is a beautiful, beautiful part of the Adirondacks. So they spent a night in Utica. They went on to Tupper Lake, which is in Franklin County, and spent the night there, right? And that's when the plot starts to really get thick.
Yes. They end up going to Big Moose Lake. I believe that was Chester's idea. Ta-da. And and they go, and it's interesting because when they traced his steps after the murder, you'll see some different aliases used along the way. And so they go to Big Moose Lake and they go to the big hotel right on the lake, and they check in and get ready. And at one point, I believe they spent one night, and then the next day they went out and they took out, back in the turn of the century, the big hotels on the water would have rowboats available for people to take out on the lake. And Big Moose is a gorgeous lake. It's absolutely beautiful. I don't believe the hotel is standing anymore, unfortunately. Dave and I took a ride up one day just out of curiosity, and it's no longer there.
Is that the Glenmore?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yes. It was gorgeous. It was absolutely beautiful in its day.
Just to build on what you're talking about, Sandy, that's sort of a great destination for people who really want to get away.
Oh, yes.
So it's north of Old Forge, an inlet, but it's remote. It's dense forests. It's beautiful and tranquil, but it's kind of serene and kind of the perfect places for murder.
Exactly.
What my brother used to say to me when I was a kid, when we were out walking the dog in the dark of night, he'd say, this is the perfect place for a murder.
You're very correct. As are a lot of the big lakes in the Adirondacks. They're very beautiful, serene. I think of Racket Lake, which is very similar to me in that respect. And so they go out. I laugh because this is where the tennis racket comes in.
I know.
They go out on the lake, and he takes his tennis racket. Now, we're not really sure at this point, why he's taking a tennis racket, but he has it. And a while later, he comes back. They don't come back for quite a while, actually. And all of a sudden, a bit later, Chester comes back in. Grace has fallen overboard, and now he can't find her. And the interesting thing about that is that in the trial, one thing that they had noticed is that they deduced that Chester must have sat there for a pretty good amount of time after she went over, regardless of whether it was at his hand or not. But he sat there because the way that the oars were situated in the boat when he got back to shore told them that they had been moved around, which means that somehow they figured out that he hadn't tried to help her, that he had just kind of sat there and waited for a while.
He clubbed her with a tennis racket, right?
That's what their theory was, and that makes very good sense to me. And so that was what was determined to be. I think when they did find her body, they were able to determine that's what he used to knock her into the water.
I read that the autopsy showed all these bruising and that she had a severe head wound, but I mean, what did she think when he was bringing this tennis racket into the rowboat? Like,
that was my question. Thank you. That was my question.
Was it like really big flies he had to swat? What was the point of the tennis racket?
Was it black fly season?
Yeah.
Maybe.
I think that in putting myself in that position, I think a young girl in the turn of the century, pregnant, who really wants to believe that he wants her to, really wants to believe that this is essentially their honeymoon, and is just willing to go along for the ride no matter what happens, because she just doesn't know any better. She doesn't realize that this is what's happening. She has no worldly experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How old was she, do you know?
19, I think it was.
19.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've read both American Tragedy and American Tragedy Revisited, which is more of it lays out the backstory, the plot line, basically where Sandy, some of the information like Sandy's brought in. It's more of the what led up to it and how it occurred, which is that particular book. And I feel like 19 was the number I remember reading.
I do think it was. And, I just feel for this girl who is essentially a child. 19 years old in 2026 is completely the opposite of 19 years old in, 1906. And she had no choice but to believe him. She had no choice but to go along with whatever Chester wanted to do because this was her life and her baby's life. So essentially, when Chester took Grace's life, he took his child's life as well, and so it really is a tragedy all the way around. So he, believe it or not, has a fresh set of clothes hidden in the woods and takes off.
No intent. I just want to say he had no intent there.
Yeah.
At all.
None whatsoever. And takes off, and they do eventually catch up with him. Long story short, they do eventually catch up with him, and he ends up in Herkimer, New York, the county seat of Herkimer County, and finds himself at the 1834 Herkimer County Jail, and eventually goes on trial across the street at the Herkimer County Courthouse.
Can we just back up a second?
Sure.
So he capsizes the boat. This is a boat that probably was owned by the hotel.
Correct.
The Glenmore. He gets to shore, and the first time I heard this story, I'm like, I would think out in the middle of the lake you would be so exposed, but they're not. They're in a very remote part of Big Moose, and he goes to shore, and then he actually goes to a different hotel and checks in under his name.
He does.
So as maybe worldly in charm, he's not that bright.
Well, you make a great point there, Jane. he truly was not. And I think that's why. I think part of the reason Chester found himself in the position he was in was because he himself had no idea about how life works. Now, we can get into, I'm sure we'll get into other aspects. When we did the investigation, I picked up a lot of things about Chester that I think fit with this story. But he just really was a kid who followed his parents around, and they were very listless. They wandered. They were in Japan at one point. They were on the West Coast. So I just don't think that he really knew much about choices.
He wasn't street smart.
No, and he always got out of he got in some trouble in prep school. He got bailed out of that. Bailed, I say, not the true word, but he got out of trouble. Then he ends up at the skirt factory with a role that is overseeing people, and here's this young man who really has had no chance to live his life the right way. He never worked his way up the ladder. He was just given a job in charge of people. And I just think that he was, in a lot of ways, not just, I think he was like life dumb. I don't think he understood how life really worked.
Yeah. And I would have to imagine too, and I don't know the facts around this, but knowing enough about manufacturing at that time in the skirt factories, the shirt factories, a lot of the women or a lot of the employees were women.
Yes.
So he's in the supervisory position in charge of all these, and he's got the name. So he's kind of hot stuff in the factory, I can imagine. So I bet he has a little ego wrapped into all of this
I was
too.
going to say, I think a lot of it was he was so full of himself, he might not have thought he could get caught.
Right.
100%. 100%. And he wasn't a bad looking young man. And so I'm sure Grace wasn't the only girl who kind of had a little crush on him and would get flustered. And he enjoyed that because he's Chester Gillette. And, he probably, Jen's right, he probably just never thought that he could do no wrong. And even if he did, it would be taken care of. And so that's probably why he decided to take care of the problem that he had.
So he checks in at, I think it was the Arrowhead Hotel.
Yes.
Which is since, like many hotels in the Adirondacks, burned to the ground.
Yes.
In 1913. Things don't just burn here, they burn to the ground.
Burn to the ground.
By all accounts, he was calm, he was dry, he seemed collected and perfectly at ease. I think I even read that he eventually, though, kind of gave himself away because he asked somebody about it, if there'd been a drowning on Big Moose Lake the day before.
Yeah, definitely not the sharpest knife in the drawer.
No.
So how do they find her? How do they recover her body? Does the hotel report the boat missing? So there's a big search. What went down?
Yes. I believe it was, again, don't quote me. This is such a story of twists and turns and webs but I think the person who was in charge of the boats actually waited until the evening. And when they still didn't come back, that's when he kind of sounded the alarm. And that's when they went out and did a search. Chester never went back to the hotel. Chester got the clothing off the shore and took off. And so I believe that's how it worked.
I read something where he actually came across a couple other people.
Yes.
As he was walking, and they remarked at the trial that he wasn't wet at all. He was completely dry.
That's right.
No indication that he'd gotten wet at all.
Right. He had hidden the clothes and had taken off. And they caught him at one of the areas, I think around the Old Forge area eventually.
Yeah. An inlet.
Yes, an inlet. Yes. And so they had gone out on a search party and they eventually, Jane, you were right. It was like a cove.
South Bay. Yeah.
On the lake. So not many people had really go to that area unless they actually want to be alone. And so that's where they found her body.
I'm doing my keyboard sleuthing right now, and I'm looking literally at Google Earth at Big Moose Lake right now. And yeah, there are many bays they could have tucked into.
Sure.
On the one hand, though, he's kind of this idiot. And on the other hand, I mean, he's pretty smart. He's calculated where he needs to go and where he can do it and not be detected. But then he just makes a bunch of other blunders.
Well, one thing about Chester that I've actually kind of deduced through the story and through interactions, I really feel as if he is was a problem solver. Chester sort of lived his life in black and white. So if he had a problem, he would figure out a way to solve the problem. And so when Grace became his problem, he solved that problem. He was very detached. He was very cold. Some have said that, and I have to agree with what I picked up on when we investigated the jail, because I actually there's a great book along with Murder in the Adirondacks, which is an American tragedy, which was written by Craig Brandon, who sadly passed away a few years ago.
Yeah, that's the book I was talking about, Murder in the Adirondacks.
Yes.
American Tragedy Revisited.
Yes, but there's also a book called The Prison Diary and Letters of Chester Gillette. And that was edited by Jack Sherman and Craig Brandon as well. And I've read that, and I took that with me to the investigation. We can talk about that more later. But one thing that I've deduced is that he had almost psychopathic tendencies. And psychopaths tend to think it very in black and white. You know, there's not much emotion. They're emotionally detached from people and things. That really fits Chester to a T. And I really believe that he was very narcissistic in that he really believed that anyone who was not Chester really had to prove their worth, or if he had a problem with them, then they were gone. That was it. He would solve that problem. And that's kind of what I picked up on. And I'm finding the more that I learned about Chester after the investigation, the more I realized that really fits him. I really think that he thought that Grace was fun and cute and good for what they were. But the idea of bringing a baby into the mix, especially if he was courting a wealthy girl that being with Grace was going to ruin everything.
He was pretty young, too. He was in his early 20s, maybe?
Yes. And he was young, and for a young man who thinks the world of himself and wants to be something and is working his way up in the Gillette family, to have a young 19-year-old girlfriend with a baby on the way was not in his plans. And so that was his problem. And he did. In essence, he solved the problem in his mind, not thinking about the consequences. In essence, thinking that, he's Chester Gillette. He'll get out of it, or somebody will get him out of it, or he won't even be caught.
But he gets arrested pretty quickly.
Yes.
I mean, they find him, they track him down, and then they haul him off to the old Herkimer County Jail. Just, again, it's that slightly out of the side the blue line, but super close. And Big Moose Lake is in the county of Herkimer. Part of Herkimer County is in the Adirondacks, so it's logical that they would take him to that jailhouse.
Yeah, it's a pretty large county. It runs very north and just a little bit south of the town seat. And great place, beautiful historic buildings. And so Chester was put in the jail. He was up on the top floor. He had essentially, I think that they gave him probably, guys, am I right, like the largest cell in the whole jail?
Yep.
Essentially, it was 2 smaller cells within a large cell, and they basically gave him the whole thing.
Is that because of his stature or his wealth or his uncles? Or
I think it was more because of the attention that it was getting. They wanted to keep him away from the rest of the community, the jail community. So he was up on the top floor, and it turned into almost a media circus in the way that it was handled. He would have visitors come just to talk to him, and he loved the attention. He enjoyed having visitors come. It really was kind of a little bit of a circus at the time. But again, nobody had really seen things like this at the time. And you're talking Herkimer, even though it was a county seat, it wasn't, you're talking the turn of, 1906, 1905, 1907. It really wasn't that large of a community. So Chester became a celebrity while he was there.
And the papers were all over this. I mean, national papers. I mean, it was big news. I read that the courtroom was packed every day. And did they also publish her love letters to him in the newspaper?
I thought I heard that. Yeah, they did. They did. I mean, imagine being her family, who loved her very much, very much.
I had read that the love letters were so sad that even the defense attorneys were seen weeping.
Oh, God.
Yes.
While they were read it in the courtroom.
That's true. I mean, like I said, in the beginning, I think what made it so touching and so revealing was how upbeat they were in the beginning. And then as he ignored her letters and didn't write to her, or very sparingly, how desperate they became.
But they don't have a lot of hard evidence to connect him to the crime. They have the tennis racket. They found that, but I'm sure there's no DNA. And well, there was DNA, but there was no DNA forensics that could connect it. They thought she had sustained some kind of blow to the head, which could have been the tennis racket. It could have been an oar. It could have been anything. First, he was like, just professed complete innocence that she had tipped over and he tried to save her. And then when they produced the evidence of all this bruising, he then changed his story a little bit, right?
Yeah, I do think he did. I cannot remember the exact story, but he did change it a little bit. And that actually was put into the trial as evidence that he had changed it. And if you're innocent, you know exactly what happened. And so, but they did convict it. One interesting thing was that when they took him down each day to the courthouse, he had to go downstairs into essentially the basement of the jail and come out the doors and walk across the street to the courthouse. And it was insane, the number of people that would be there every day to watch Chester, to see Chester. He literally became a celebrity. And I think that's part of what made this such almost a legendary crime, because it just soaked into the culture of that area of New York State, because it was such a big emotional circus. The media was there. His family was there. It was just a lot for one small town at the time to take on. And it sort of radiated outward. And then it became almost folklore, almost a legend. And people to this day are fascinated by it. There's talks, there's tours, there have been Grace Brown ceremonies over the years, celebrating 100 years and et cetera, et cetera. And so it's really become like this very personal journey for a lot of people because of its notoriety.
Let's talk about that, but just to put a pin in it.
Yes.
He's found guilty. They try to appeal. It's rejected. And then he's sent to the prison in Auburn, New York, which is near Buffalo, Steve.
Auburn is west of Syracuse.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's really quite an interesting looking prison. It looks, you drive up to it, you know it's a prison.
Yeah.
One fun fact about Auburn, too, is that Harriet Tubman is also buried there.
Oh, wow.
That's where she ended up finishing out the years of her life. And her grave is there. And so we visited that a couple of times to pay our respects. And so it's a wonderful town, Steve. Like you said, it's just a little bit southwest of Syracuse. And he spent his time in Auburn prison before he was sent to his death via electric chair.
He's lucky because up until the 1890s, they were still hanging people.
Yeah.
So that's insane.
And one interesting note, in the prison diary and the letters, not one time in any of these prison diary entries or letters does he ever, ever, ever confess that he did anything. Not once does he mention it. He talks a lot about his family, his day-to-day. Some people say that it's because he knew that his stuff would be read in case there was any kind of an appeal that was, accepted. But yeah, not once did he ever even, I think one time in the whole book, he referred to Grace, and it was in passing.
Did his family support him?
He and his sister were very close. He wrote a lot of letters to his sister. She actually moved there to stay close to him. His mother and father were, at one point, were there. He was fairly close to them, but he and his sister were extremely close. And so he did have his family with him.
What's striking to me is, well, so many things, but the story doesn't really end with the verdict and with his electrocution. It's kind of snowballs and becomes bigger. And Theodore Dreiser writes, An American Tragedy. It came out in 1925. It was over 800 pages long. Damon, I give you credit for getting through it.
I know. I agree.
I tried. I mean, we've had this episode scheduled for 2 months.
It was
several
several years in the making on that one, because it was one I would read, set down, come back to, read, set down. Yeah, it was sat in my mom's bookcase forever. It was one of those things I was like, oh, let's just read this because it's about the Adirondacks. It sounds cool.
The older I get, the harder it is for me to sit still in one time and read like that. So God bless you, Damon.
I agree. Thank you.
For me, it's like, you know what's going to happen. And I don't like things when I know that even watching A Place in the Sun, I had a really hard time with that because it just doomed. And
yeah.
I didn't even like to watch I Love Lucy when I was a kid because I knew she was going to get in trouble, So I like...
Right.
I had a hard time with it, but it was a massive bestseller. It is actually considered one of the great American novels. It fictionalizes their story, but Dreiser was really, depending on your point of view, some people refer to him as a muckraker, but he was really looking at social pressure, class ambition, the promise and failure for some people for the American dream, and why that creates such horrific consequences for some people. But, it's pretty faithful, I think, Damon. I don't know if you would agree with that, to the actual story. Chester Gillette is referred to as Clyde Griffiths, and Grace Brown is referred to as Roberta Alden. And a lot of the core events are very accurate with the true story. And then they would go on to Hollywood would produce 2 films based on the novel. One is called An American Tragedy, and the other one, A Place in the Sun, with Montgomery Clift and Elizabeth Taylor, strays a bit from the actual story. It adds probably, more things for dramatic effect.
And so you got that artistic license that was added into the movies, I'm sure. I never watched the movies, but I would assume.
The movie's really good. And he's Elizabeth Taylor's just absolutely radiant. She plays not Grace Brown, she plays a wealthy love interest, which sort of provides that theatrical license to, plays a socialite that he's interested in, which justifies why he wants to get rid of the Grace Brown character, who is brilliantly played by Shelley Winters. Sandy, without knowing when I saw it at the time, you really get her desperation, as you alluded to in her letters. And, Shelley Winters always plays like the worst character.
I know.
She always plays a sad sack, drowning on the Poseidon, or,
You're correct.
that kind of stuff. So again, she was brilliantly cast.
Yeah.
The movie won 6 Academy Awards. But I don't think I don't know if you guys know this or not. I know for sure Place in the Sun was filmed on set in California. It wasn't filmed here. And I don't think the first American Tragedy was filmed here either. All right. Well, that sort of ties the bow on the story of Chester Gillette, the tragic story of Chester Gillette and Grace Brown. It really was a tragic story and a crime that unfolded on an Adirondack lake and captured the attention of the entire nation. The case inspired this landmark novel, major Hollywood films, and more than a century of debate about ambition, morality, and the darker side of the American dream. But for some people who have spent time inside the old jailhouse where Gillette was tried, this story is not entirely finished. Next week in part 2, we'll hear more from the Adirondack Park Paranormal Society about their investigations inside the historic jail. The encounters, they say, connect directly to this case and another notorious figure from the building's past. You won't want to miss it. So make sure, if you don't already subscribe to ADK Talks wherever you get podcasts. Visit our website, adktaste.com, for show notes and links to some of the documents and places we've talked about today. Also, the apps folks have a great Facebook profile with the latest information. And we probably should have said this earlier. You guys have a podcast. So, Damon, will you just tell our audience where they can find you and hear more about the paranormal in the Adirondacks and beyond?
So they can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/apps paranormal.
APPS.
Paranormal. We don't have a website anymore. We've strictly gone to Facebook. The website just wasn't really doing anything for us. You can also catch our podcast, which we've kind of taken a little bit of a hiatus on. We'll be coming back to it here very soon, within the month, I think. Which also has its own Facebook group and page, which is the Apt Alchemy podcast. And we do have a link tree on our main Facebook page to get to the other Facebook page for the podcast.
We'll have all this in the show notes, listener. So be sure to check that out if you can before next week's episode. Thanks, and we'll see you soon on the pod.